Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Costly Conversations. Is silence in your workplace affecting your bottom line? David Maxfield and Chase McMillan, best-selling authors and leading researchers at VitalSmarts, will share the results of their study into the costs of failing to speak up and engage in dialogue. We'll now turn the time over to Chase and David.
Hey, welcome everybody. I'm David Maxfield.
And I'm Chase McMillan.
So we're here to talk about costly conversations. We've done a study where we try to calculate how much is the avoidance of crucial conversations costing you. So Chase is going to tell you sort of the background of this study.
Yeah, to get us started, I want to tell you about a study we did years ago where we went into a busy, crowded mall around Christmas time, just like malls are now. And we asked people, what would happen if someone cut in front of you in line, whether it's at a busy movie theater or a long checkout line? And majority of people said, well, I'd speak up. I'd say something. So we tested that hypothesis. We said, let's put in some hidden cameras and actually have some Confederates jump in line and see what would happen. Guess what happened? No one spoke up. People would cut in line and the people behind them would kind of give them a nasty glance, but they wouldn't say anything. Only 1 in 20 spoke up. Now, this might be a frivolous study, but speaking up is anything but frivolous. We've done studies in the healthcare world, for example, and 90% of nurses don't speak up when they see something that a physician is doing that presents patient safety problems. We did a workplace safety study that showed 93% of people said they've seen an accident waiting to happen because people are unwilling to speak up when people are doing something unsafe in the workplace. So this is a big, important issue, and it can cost organizations a whole lot of money. So, like David said, we wanted to kind of quantify the costs of not speaking up. So here's the study. We asked over 1,000 people to share with us a story and calculate the costs of times where they had concerns at work but didn't speak up, where they failed to voice these conversations, where they bit their tongue instead of express their true concerns. And we found a lot of interesting stories. Here's an example. So Steve worked with a colleague whose disrespectful behavior and verbal abuse went unchecked. Steve never said anything. His colleagues never said anything. And even management avoided conversation with the office bully. Instead, they complained and gossiped about the problem. Team morale deteriorated until eventually 4 employees quit, believing the organization tolerated bullying behavior. Have you seen that in your workplace? Is being a bully tolerated? That's what these people thought. Another story we received was like this. Shauna participated in a project meeting where a plan was presented, and many in attendance noticed an obvious flaw. And yet, instead of voicing their concerns, people whispered about the fatal flaw in the hallway. After several months of work, the project plan indeed failed to meet output goals and lost the funding to continue. You can imagine how costly this is in an organization. Failed projects, lack of funding, inability to solve tough and complex problems. We found that when people didn't speak up, there was 3 conditions present. There was opposing opinions, strong emotions around high-stakes issues. These were crucial conversations. These were situations where people felt frustrated, upset, angry, and instead of voicing their opinions, they bit their tongue. We often find these are the crossroads to results. You handle these crucial conversations and step up well, you're on the road to success in your organizations. And if you don't, you're on the road to ruin. And we found when people don't speak up, it was incredibly costly for the organization. Take it away, David.
All right, great. Thanks, Chase. So what I want to do is describe some of what we think is going on behind the scenes, inside people's heads, as to what's happening during these things that causes them not to speak up. So I like to introduce this section by showing a photo of Mount Cannon. If you were at Glacier National Park, this is what you'd see out the front of the lodge. Mount Cannon is named after this guy, Walter Cannon. He and his wife were the first in recorded history to summit this mountain. So Walter Cannon and his wife were sort of renowned mountaineers in their day. And their day was like the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, when he wasn't climbing mountains, what Walter Cannon did was he was head of internal medicine at Harvard, where he studied the digestion system. He was known as an innovator. He's one of the first ever to use X-rays to study anatomy. Now, if you think about it, it's a little peculiar to use X-rays to study digestion, because X-rays are good at seeing what? Bones, right? So unless you've been eating a lot of chicken wings, you're not going to see a whole lot in an X-ray of your gut. So he's the guy who invented what we call the barium meal that makes your gut opaque so you can actually see it in X-rays. This is a cool guy. He did a lot of stuff. But what he's known for most was what happened during World War I. When World War I broke out, he left Harvard and he went to Europe to try to save lives in the trenches. And what he discovered, and what's still true today, is that soldiers who are wounded in battle are far more likely to die of shock than to die of the disease or the injury itself. And at that time, medicine didn't have a model for understanding shock. So when he got back to Harvard at the end of the World War I, he devoted the rest of his career to trying to understand what is shock, how does it work, why is it there, right? So here's an example from the book he wrote. You'll say, okay, our ancestor, let's say, had stepped outside the cave, right, and was building a campfire when all of a sudden they saw a saber-toothed cat. What would happen? Okay, biologically, what would happen is their body would be flooded with adrenaline and blood would rush to their major muscle groups. What were they getting ready to do? He called it fight or flight. So the title of the book he wrote is called The Fight or Flight Syndrome. He's the one who coined that phrase. So we're updating that to today. We're saying, okay, when you're in a situation where your boss is abusive or where there's a bully on your team or there's some other, maybe your project has a fatal flaw, it's as if you're seeing a saber-toothed cat. That adrenaline floods your body and you're ready for fight or flight. And guess what? It's flight that we're seeing in the workplace. Now, let me update this theory just a little bit beyond Walter Cannon and World War I. So there's a new book out. Michael Lewis, who you may know the author, he wrote Moneyball, and he wrote the biggest...
Losers, yeah.
The current book's called Losers. Do you remember his other book? He wrote another wonderful book about the crash.
Big Short?
The Biggest Short.
The Biggest Short.
I'm supposed to remember this stuff. Okay, so Losers is about two psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and it reads like a detective story. Now, I'm involved in this a little bit because I was at Stanford when they were there, and I sat in on their classes, I took their seminars, and learned a lot of this stuff I'm talking about here. So Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics. There's a reason economics is called the dismal science. It's dismal because at its base, its fundamental assumption is what they call the theory of the rational man. Have you ever met a rational man? Right? They don't exist, right? So what Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman did was they documented all the different ways in which we don't behave like rational people in economic situations. In fact, they're credited with inventing the whole field of behavioral economics, right? And that's why Amos would have gotten the Nobel Prize along with Danny, but Amos died young. It was very sad. Okay, so Danny wins this prize. He writes a book that came out just like a couple years ago. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. Let me share it because it's the brain side of what's going on in fight or flight. What he found is when you're faced with either a temptation, right, or a threat, you stop behaving rationally. You move from your slow, logical, analytic, normal self into this fast-paced, intuitive, emotional decision maker. And we mess up. We do it with our boss. We do it with our colleagues, and we get in trouble. And so next time we go to flight, right? So that's kind of what we're working with. Now I want to take that and say, okay, if that's what's going on, we're nervous, we're scared, we're going to flight, what impact does this have on the organization? So here's the situation, the ugly reality, right? People have concerns and they don't speak up. Maybe you butt in front of them in line or whatever. They have concerns, but they don't speak up. So what happens? Those concerns don't go away. They fester. They turn ugly, right? and they explode. The person flips from silence to violence. It's not a gradual change, it's a flip, right? And that's what we're concerned about. How do we take people who are holding this silence inside, their concerns are festering, they're getting ugly, how do we get them to speak up in an appropriate way rather than flipping? That's what we're looking at. So let me turn it back to you, Chase. And, I'm sorry, I had one more slide.
Oh, yes, please.
This is just a summary. Okay, this is you, right? Look in the mirror. This is you. This is your brain. Most of the time, you're this logical, reasonable, rational person. But then when you face a crucial conversation and those emotions kick in, this is who you become, right? Your brain, your whole body is designed for fight or flight. The very times you need to be at your very best, you end up at your very worst. That's the challenge.
Right. And unfortunately, it's not just a personal challenge that we're up against. This is a cultural challenge. It's not just you, it's our company cultures. This fight or flight response gets reinforced by our organizations. People on an organizational level may not have the skills to handle these tough conversations, to step up in an effective way, so they hold their tongue. That becomes a normative behavior. That's what's expected from people in the organization, to bite their tongue because they don't feel safe speaking up. Now, this is reinforced by bosses who may not necessarily show the right behavior or model the right skills when these crucial conversations happen. And they may not be creating the conditions of safety where people feel safe surfacing these issues. You look at structural reinforcers where it's not rewarded to speak up in these conversations. In fact, maybe speaking your mind gets you a ding on your performance review. And systematically, it gets reinforced to stay silent. So these are cultural problems we're up against. It's not just an individual problem that we need to fix. It's not just you, it's your culture. So back to the study. As we looked at the data and analyzed the stories that people gave us around times that they had failed to speak up, we saw 5 themes emerge very clearly. Let me kick off the first one here. First was prickly peers. People were unable or failed to speak up when there was a bully in the room, when people lost their cool and went to violence, when they used harsh language, backbiting, bullying. They'd see these behaviors and they wouldn't speak up. They didn't want to confront these prickly peers because they were worried that it might blow up in their face. Right? So we saw dozens and dozens of stories where people saw bad behavior among their peers and they didn't say anything.
So I'll go to number 2. We'll call them ticking time bombs. And let me share a little of how we got these stories. So as Chase described, we had this survey, but one of the survey items was what we call a story collector, where it asked someone to think of a time when they had a concern but failed to speak up and give us the rundown. What was the circumstance? Who was involved? What did they not do? What should they have done? And so we got these really kind of cool stories, and close to 1,000 of them. So another one is the ticking time bombs. This is when we did a project management research. We found one similar to this, and we called it dead project walking. So a ticking time bomb is when you know something is wrong with your project, something is wrong with the task you're working on. In fact, it's got a fatal flaw. But it feels unsafe to talk about the fatal flaw. So you walk around it, and sure enough, the flaw is fatal. It eventually explodes and destroys whatever it is the group of you is working on.
Right. The next big category that we saw was lazy and incompetent colleagues.
Have you been interviewing my colleagues?
You know a couple of these, huh?
Oh, man.
Hopefully I don't fall in that category. So lazy and incompetent colleagues. This is when people fail to speak up, when someone's not pulling their own weight, when they're maybe incompetent, they're lacking certain skills that they need in order to get the job done and done well. So they end up shouldering the task themselves, working around these colleagues instead of confronting them, which turns into all sorts of extra time. It adds to schedules. It turns into workarounds. It turns into skirting processes and procedures. They work around these lazy and incompetent colleagues, and it puts a serious drag on the organization. It kills engagement, it kills productivity, and it creates all sorts of problems with the organization.
So this next one we call abusive bosses. Kind of explains itself, right? This is not the most common category, but it's out there. It's one of the most costly because an abusive boss doesn't just affect the storyteller, right? It's not just, I notice this. It's like, I notice how this affects a whole team or a whole team of teams, right? So when you have someone like that in your organization, the ramifications are really gigantic.
And the last one is management chaos. This is failure to get clarification when you're uncertain on what the objectives are or project specs or roles or responsibilities in the organization. This one was really interesting because time and time again people wrote in and said they didn't have clarification on important specs around projects and other large initiatives, and yet they didn't feel safe speaking up. They thought that maybe they'd be judged by their peers or seen as incompetent by their managers. So instead, they just plodded along, trying to get as much work done as they could. It created all sorts of problems, like working in the wrong direction or creating projects that didn't meet original specs. So this management chaos that ensued because people didn't want to raise their hand and say, hey, what's going on here? Not quite sure what I should be doing or who should be doing what. So it created all sorts of chaos in the organization.
So in addition to the actual, so this sort of is the summary. So here are the 5 that we found. But in addition to these, to asking the global story question, we also had a lot of sort of pre-baked concerns that we wanted to ask. When you face this concern, do you speak up? And I want to share some of those and to share just how bad it is. When others fail to pull their own weight, so which turned into the prickly pears, right? Almost 3/4 of people say they don't speak up. Now, going into this, we were anticipating that what we'd see would be numbers like 10% not speaking up, 25% not speaking up, maybe a little higher than that. But all these ones I share with you, they are through the roof, right? When others perform below expectations, the norm is to not speak up. Right? When others disrespect somebody, the norm again. Between 2/3 and 3/4 don't speak up. When others skirt important processes, like they're not following safety processes or quality protocols, more than half of people fail to speak up. When others are resisting change, not my problem, I don't speak up, right? And finally, as Chase was saying, when there's confusion, ambiguity over things like who holds the decision rights for this, people in general don't speak up, even though it seems so obvious. This is how you would clarify what the decision rights are. Right? So what does this all cost? When we did this, and you can quibble some with how we calculate these costs, so I want to explain how we did it. Right? So what we found was we asked people to describe a conversation they know they should have had but failed to have. And all the people who responded, of all these, more than 1,000 people, they all said, yes, this has happened to me, I can name one. We said, okay, now some people might have more than one, right? They might have 100, right? But everyone had at least one. And we asked, how much time did you waste talking about it with other people, ruminating about it, avoiding it, doing extra work because of it? And the median person, right? So the average employee said they wasted 7 work days or more. Now, when I say median rather than mean, if I were to say the mean, this number would have gone even higher, right? Because there are some people who said, oh no, we wasted years, right? So we were looking at just sort of the average person in our survey said they wasted 7 days or more. And 40%, almost half of the people said it was 2 weeks or more that were wasted because of this, because of failing to speak up. Now let's turn this into dollars. We could do something like try to calculate what's the average, hourly pay. We didn't do that. We asked the people, how much did this cost, right? And what we found was that the average person said that failing to have this conversation cost $7,500 in time and resources. Now, there were some that were far, far higher, right? But the average person in here said this conversation I didn't hold Cost us $7,500. Now again, maybe that's the only conversation they have that's that expensive. Or maybe they have 20 others just like it. We don't know. But boy, this is a marker that's a lot higher than we expected. And 1 in 5 employees, or 20%, say the costs were $50,000 or more. Which brought to my mind, I had a meeting with the CEO of a large engineering firm, a global engineering firm, and he closed the door. He sort of put his hands on the table and said, let me tell you where we're at. I was at a retirement dinner 2 months ago with a senior vice president who was in charge of building, I want to say, a power plant, like a huge enterprise. And it was his retirement dinner. And he said, that enterprise lost us close to $1 billion. There are people on my team who knew it was going to fail. It was one of those dead projects walking. We knew it was going to fail, but they didn't have the nerve to tell you and me because they were afraid of us. And the CEO said, we've got to change that. So that cost them $1 billion. All right. Beyond that, it has all the effects you could imagine on employee engagement, relationships, deadlines, budgets, culture in general. Not having these conversations, the cost of silence is through the roof.
And unless you've got money to burn, you may be wondering, what can we do about it? What can we do to reverse this trend? Right. So we're going to talk about 2 different strategies. What you can do personally to speak up in these troublesome situations, and what you can do at an organizational level to make sure that you can overcome these norms of silence in your organization. So first, what can you do? First idea is reverse your thinking. Now, oftentimes we do this mental math in our head around these costly conversations, around these crucial conversations, and we outweigh the risks of speaking up. We catastrophize in our head and say, if I speak up, this is going to cause damage to the relationship, and you know what? It's probably not going to even solve the issue. Reverse your thinking by inflating the costs of not speaking up. Consider what are the costs of not speaking up. And we've identified some for you in this study. It could be $7,500 or more, right? It could be a loss of engagement. It could be project failure. Focus on the costs of not speaking up. Reverse your thinking.
Chase, it relates a lot to sort of the saber-toothed cat and the fight or flight kind of syndrome, in that when something hits me and I'm afraid, that saber-toothed cat appears, my thinking becomes very short-term, like it's about survival, and very personal, very selfish, I'll say. Right? I'm thinking about me and my survival rather than thinking long-term and more inclusive as to our survival and our success.
Yeah,
I think that's what happens, that we think short-term about the negatives, and we fail to realize we're already experiencing the costs. Everybody is.
Absolutely.
And so I agree. I think reversing the thinking there can help.
Great. Well, take us to the next one, David.
Okay, so the next one is, we call it change your emotions. Challenge again. Remember I was saying people fail to speak up, so the problems fester and they turn ugly. Well, chances are that's already happening, right? It's festering, you're feeling ugly, and you're feeling angry. So before you have the conversation and have a blow-up, stop. Ask yourself, don't demonize the other person. Say, why might a rational, reasonable, decent person be doing what they're doing, right? And try to approach them with curiosity rather than judgment. If you can change your emotions so that you're approaching with curiosity, you're going to be a lot more successful because you're not going to create defensiveness.
Great tip, David. So work on me first and the other person second.
Yeah.
Right? So much we can do. We have so much more control over ourselves than the other person. So that's a good place to start. Next one would be make others feel safe. Oftentimes we buy into this myth that there's just certain things we can't talk about. There's certain untouchable topics, and if we do talk about them, it's going to create defensiveness and problems. That couldn't be further from the truth. Skillful communicators know that it's not the topic that creates sensitivity, but it's safety in the conversation. If they can make it safe in the conversation, they can talk to almost anyone about almost anything. Now, safety is built upon 2 conditions: respect and intent. if we can communicate we have good intent for the conversation and we can communicate our respect for the other person, we can create the conditions where the other person feels safe and we can speak up. We can hold these tough conversations, whether it's around prickly peers, abusive bosses, management chaos, whatever it may be, we can hold these conversations if we can create enough safety.
Yeah, let me give you an example of that one. This is one that I was working with a group of anesthesiologists, and they felt that one of their new members to their team was dangerously incompetent. How's that,
Scary.
right? And it was an anesthesiologist, right? Sheesh. And they hadn't talked to him about it. So we wanted to facilitate that conversation. And as we talked about it, it was very much in their interest. It was very much their desire to make it safe for this person and yet not to pull their punches, not to sugarcoat it. So they wanted to come to this person and say, we're your friends, we're your partners. Our intent is to remain your friends and your partners. We want you to work with us in our partnership, in our practice, until you retire, 30 years from now. At the same time, you're doing 3 or 4 things that we feel are dangerous to our patients and to your patients. And it's the last thing you'd want to do. We know you don't intend this. We want to work with you. If it takes years, we want to work with you. We're not giving up on you. They're trying to make him feel safe at the same time sharing this really, what do you say, disappointing?
Absolutely.
Tough message.
Nice. Very effective example.
So the last is invite dialogue. Don't come in with a pre-baked solution or a pre-baked opinion. Come in, share the facts of what you've seen and what you've heard. Share your perspective, your story about what these facts mean. But be open. Don't be dogmatic. Be open and invite dialogue. Make it mutual so they can share their point of view. Perhaps you'll learn. At minimum, perhaps they'll become part of the solution and hold themselves more accountable. So those are the few steps for getting started on what you personally can do when you feel like you're going to silence inappropriately. So now let's turn to what solutions can an organization or manager do to help change the norms in their department or in their organization. You want to take it, Chase?
Good. So the first one that we'd suggest would be what we call leading the way. This is focused on managers and leaders, opinion leaders in the organization. What can they do in order to reverse norms and create new behaviors around these costly conversations? Now, we know that people look up to their leaders. They follow their behaviors. They behave in kind. So if we can get leaders on board to lead the way, and by leading the way, I mean creating safety for people to speak up, you can reverse these norms. So what does that look like? It looks like leaders using skills to create safety when people have concerns, making sure that they feel safe to speak up. In one organization we worked with, Menlo Innovations, one of their behaviors that they focus on is having managers say thank you when programmers bring up bad news. They might be behind on the schedule, and if they bring it up, the manager is going to say thank you for bringing up that bad news. No, that's not easy. It's kind of a tricky thing to do, to speak up to your manager. But by reinforcing those behaviors and creating the safety, leading the way, they can reverse the norms of silence. So it may take a sacrifice of ego, of time, of resources for leaders to communicate to the organization that it is safe to speak up. And when you do so, you're rewarded instead of punished. So think about that. Can we get the leaders on board to reverse that norm of silence by leading the way?
The second one is to give people the skills they need. You knew you'd hear that somewhere in this webinar, right? It's like, yeah, there's a reason that we're a training company, because people don't have these skills. My father used to say that these are skills you pick up at your mother's knee or some other low joint. Well, a lot of people don't pick them up at all, or the skills they have are pretty poor. So how can you get those skills? And of course, we offer skill building that can help. Let me link it to the lead the way. The best possible is if you have leaders who do the training, who facilitate the courses, because when they're training, they're not only giving people skills, they're giving people permission and modeling how to use those skills.
Great. The next one would be using carrots and sticks. And by that I mean linking the behaviors of speaking up honestly and openly when you have concerns to performance. Oftentimes this is something that gets left out of the performance management system. But if you can include that, we rate people on their propensity or their likelihood or their performance in the past of speaking up when time gets tough. And doing so in a respectful way that creates dialogue. So connect this to performance management, reward those that speak up, and maybe ding those that don't speak up or speak up in inappropriate ways. That's part of creating a system to reverse that norm of silence.
And the last one is make it matter with measures. If you can't measure it, it's really hard to know if you're getting better or you're getting worse. So we already have measures in place that I'll say are above the waterline measures. So when you're measuring performance of your team, you're probably measuring their attainment of their budget, their timelines and schedules, their deadlines, the qualities and specs in their projects. You're measuring a lot, but you're probably not measuring whether people feel the psychological safety that they can speak up and that they can actually participate. Now, the big teamwork, Project Aristotle, that Google has been doing over the last few years show that those two measures, the active participation, the ability to speak up, and the psychological safety, are the drivers of successful teams. And we know that's not just true at Google. That's true across the board. Amy Edmondson at Harvard has been studying this for years and has found those same results. So measure some of the below the waterline, the precursors, the advanced warning signals of are you going to have a problem by measuring psychological safety within the team and measuring propensity to speak up. Now, Vital Smarts has surveys that we can make available for you to use in your team if you're interested.
Great. And with that, we'd like to wrap up this discussion and say there are costly conversations in your organization. Hopefully these tips help in combating those and actually equipping people with the skills they need and the organizational culture they need in order to speak up and speak up well. So with that, I think we'd like to turn it to question and answers, unless you have anything else you'd like to add, David.
I want to go to you can pick up this research and share it with your teams. We've got an infographic you can download. You can see it on your screen here. But yeah, we've spent about a half hour or so presenting our side. We'd love to answer a few questions. So if I see some questions have come in, so we'll alternate back and forth. I'll take this first one. It's from Kathy. I sometimes feel that I'm going behind someone's back by speaking about problems I observe happening. But if I don't speak up, the problem may continue. If I do speak up, it's for the good of the group or organization. Is it okay to speak up in this case? Well, I'm going to suggest, Kathy, that you want to speak up not behind someone's back, but to their face. And that can be challenging sometimes because of distance and time and availability. You don't have the opportunity to speak up to them. But more typically, you're not speaking up to them because you're afraid of them. That you feel like it's too big a risk to speak to them because maybe you're not their boss, right? Or maybe they're your boss. But I'm going to argue that the place to begin is with finding a way to speak up to the person themselves.
Great.
Take the next one?
Yes, I'll take the next one. Hi, Lisa. You asked, do you also see at times that speaking up is more accepted from men than women? Now, unfortunately, the answer would be yes to this. We've done some research, and I'd point you to our research paper, Emotional Inequality, which you can find on our website, that found that women get dinged more when they speak up in an assertive way. It's an unfortunate and unfair phenomenon, and it's something that needs to be dealt with at an organizational level. I know that Facebook put out some training on implicit bias, and they've put that out free to the masses. That might be a nice place to start. That's a discussion that should definitely be held and an issue that should be tackled organization-wide. And
let me highlight again, it's what you're describing is what is the case in today's culture, not what should be the case.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That there shouldn't be a greater penalty for women when they speak up, but in today's culture there seems to be. Now, we at Vital Smarts, we've been looking at skills that an individual woman or anyone could use to help minimize that kind of risk. And one of them, I'll just share quickly, is starting with a value statement, explaining why you're speaking up and why it's helpful to them, to the other person. State your mutual purpose before then speaking up. So it sounds kind of like, this topic is a matter of integrity to me, so I need to be real clear about where I stand. That little pre-statement before your facts helps the person understand, okay, this person's not angry, they're not out of control, they're passionate, because this is having to do with integrity. And it reduces that effect substantially.
Yeah, good advice.
So I'll try another of these. How do you suggest handling this when your boss is the issue? Yeah. Well, let me say rule number one. I'm not asking anyone to commit organizational suicide. There are bosses, with horns and everything else that I'm not going to confront, that it's just not safe, right? And I'm not asking you to take risks that are going to put your career or your physical safety at harm, right? At the same time, I think as Chase was saying, we tend to catastrophize. We tend to imagine far worse consequences than actually happen, right? That if you can give coaching to your boss, if you can confront and speak up to your boss, hold your boss accountable in a way that's respectful, that's caring, that demonstrates that you're on your boss's team. So for instance, you say something like, gee, Mr. or Ms. Manager, I'm on your side. I want to support you. I am going to support you no matter what. At the same time, I've noticed a few things that I think are undermining your ability to achieve the goals that we're all trying to go after. Would it be okay if I shared some of my observations? See, as a way to ask her permission or his permission and try to make it clear you're on their side. You're doing this as a friend, not as an antagonist. Right?
Yeah, that idea of mutual purpose and mutual respect pervades all of these conversations, and if we can show that mutual purpose and mutual respect, we'll be a lot more effective in holding these conversations. It's a good segue to Eva's question here. She said, I just wonder if the same principles are applicable to larger societal issues. For example, discussions between friends and family about politics. Those are high stakes, strong emotions, and opposing opinions. And the the answer to that would be absolutely. These skills apply whether you're in the office place or whether you're at home with family and friends. In fact, we recently did a study around political discussions. What we found was that when people show that they're seeking mutual purpose, trying to identify common ground instead of what they have, instead of focusing on differences, they're far more effective in holding these conversations and maintaining relationships. We also found that when people ask questions to try to understand the other person's point of view versus jamming their point of view down the other person's throat, it builds relationships, and you know what? It was far more influential. People had more influence by skillfully holding this conversation than if they were a little more aggressive or combatant when they held these conversations. So short answer, yes, we can use the same skills at home as we can in the workplace to get better results and strengthen relationships. And I'd point you to our latest political study that you can download on our website.
Okay, how about one more? This is from Emily. I'm a manager with a small department, about 7 people. I've taken the Crucial Conversations course, and I have my employees coming to me with complaints about each other. How do I facilitate resolution between them? Right? So she's caught where she's the one who's got the crucial conversation skills, and she's expected to handle disagreements that relate to each other. What I like to do in that situation is coach them, share a few principles, and then role play it with them, where you play the difficult person and they have to be the problem solver. And so role play it with them, give them a little feedback, give them some coaching, some hints, and if necessary, sit in on the conversation, but preferably go back and let them start the conversation, assuming that you feel like it's safe enough, right? Let them have the conversation. They'll experience that success and gain confidence as well. Great. Let's wrap it up at that. Thank you so much for all of you joining, and please head to our website and download the study. I think you'll find it fascinating.
It's been great being with you this morning or afternoon or wherever you are. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Hopefully you found some ideas that are useful and you can use in your organization to get better results and create stronger relationships.
Thank you for your time today. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation. To download the infographic of our research, visit www.vitalsmarts.com/costly conversations.